Welcome to an all-new episode of the McFuture podcast. I'm Steve Faktor, and today I have a spectacular guest. Nadine Strossen was president of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, for 18 years. And in case you don't know, they defend free speech and civil liberties for Americans for free. They're all lawyers. In fact, she's a law professor at NYU and author of a new book called Hate, which has a very long subtitle, but this is a crash course on everything free speech, whether you're super into cancel culture and want to get people fired, or on the other side of the spectrum. There's something for everyone in this conversation. And in the bonus episode on Patreon, I have a theory of how to solve this whole cancel culture crisis. And you'll get to hear whether Nadine buys into my premise or not. Anyway, here's the conversation, and don't forget to review, share, subscribe if you enjoy it. Well, it's funny because I grew up loving radio. I would listen to everything. I would listen to comedy, and I would listen to conservative and liberal. And so to me, it was the dream job. You never had to look good. You could just show up and just talk into a microphone. But now I think the game has been raised a little bit.
They use that phrase, the radio face, right?
That's right. I've had one of those for most of my life. For someone who has a fairly sunny disposition, it's kind of odd that your book is called Hate. There's a longer subtitle that clearly did not fit here. But, and I'm so used to framing the problem as I see it in my words. So I would love to hear from you, what is the problem? Do we have a problem?
There is a problem of too much hatred and stereotyping and discrimination. I really am agnostic on debates about whether it's worse now than it used to be, because I think there are so many challenges to the measure, right? First of all, what one person considers to be hate, somebody else considers to be either neutral or more extreme would consider to be a positive message. So it's a very subjective concept. Nonetheless, it is, I see so much evidence every day of individuals hurling the H word or hateful words toward various people, not only on the basis of who they are, but also very significantly on the basis of what they believe. We are, in my perception as a longtime law professor and longtime speaker on the campus lecture circuit, we are seeing an exponential increase of expressed hatred and contempt for people whose ideas we disagree with. And that has led to a term that, and a phenomenon that is a term that's used to describe the phenomenon of so-called cancel culture, signifying that the criticism is going beyond critiques of particular ideas, which all of us free speech defenders and practitioners welcome, right? That's what it's about, debate and dissent and discussion and disagreement. But the goal of canceling is to eliminate not only an idea entirely as supposedly being beyond the bounds of discussion, but worse yet, to eliminate particular speakers, to deny them not only particular platforms, but aiming to shut them up entirely, make them lose their jobs, make them lose any outlet for publication.
If you think about recent history, what have been some of the most egregious examples that popped out to you and said, really, what is going on here?
As a professor, and again, as somebody who meets with so many students on campuses all over the country and beyond, and also many middle and high school students and their teachers, I am most concerned about the extremely punitive measures that are being enforced against young people that will surely put a blight over their entire future life prospects. The most based on an isolated social media tweet, even something that they might have posted years ago and that are inconsistent with their overall record. And probably the most punitive action that's been taken against those young people is the retraction of admissions to the colleges of their choice. There's just been a rash which has increased this year. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, keeps track of this, of young people having been accepted to Harvard and other outstanding universities, suddenly being told, somebody brought to our attention something that you posted on social media even years ago, even out of context. And even if the student has sincerely apologized, said, I was drunk, I mean, that's not the greatest thing to be proud of, but it's different from showing that you were some unreconstructed, unreconstructable racist who has to be denied all educational opportunities.
Yeah, this idea of irredeemability, there's a thread of cynicism in it as well, because I think that everyone likes to believe, and in fact, the same person who will say, oh, we should give prisoners another chance, we should rehabilitate them, that same exact person will dig up a tweet or something someone said on a podcast 5 years ago and say, oh, let's cancel this person, let's get them fired. So I'm like, it's okay for us to want to rehabilitate prisoners who did illegal
violent
things.
Acts.
Violent acts, exactly. But someone who said something stupid online, that person is irredeemable.
And let me be clear about it. I am, as somebody who has for decades been crusading against the mass incarceration and overly punitive nature of our criminal legal system, I am thrilled that over the past number of years we've had a consensus building, starting, quite frankly, with conservatives, and because liberals are afraid of being accused of being soft on crime, but a consensus that we have been too punitive, and it is no better for society and for integrating somebody into society as a productive, constructive member than it is for individual liberty. And you are absolutely right that there is a complete disconnect between this restorative approach, even to people who have committed murder and other violent crimes, but heaven forbid you should say something that somebody else interprets as being insensitive, that then the equivalent of the death penalty, lose your job, lose your platform. And we're making this interview on the day that John Lewis is lying in state and being honored as well he should. He and so many towering leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States, including Dr. Martin Luther King, but also other great human rights champions who accomplished enormous transformations in their societies. Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, all of these people practiced and preached forgiveness, redemption, reconciliation. Even those who had directly beaten them and oppressed them and subjugated them, that was their response. And you can't call it weak when you see the positive results that were achieved.
Well, most famously, Nelson Mandela, it would be very easy. It would have been very easy for him to seek retribution against the white population when he got out of prison and took power. But instead, he did these reconciliation councils, and basically it was a way for everyone to air all of these issues and ugly experiences that they had in order to cleanse themselves. It's almost a kind of a verbal absolution instead of a violent absolution, which I fear we might actually end up with if we're not careful.
Yes, and again, there's a little bit of a disconnect. We've been talking about the disconnect between restorative justice and the criminal justice system. And by the way, that's very much in the forefront now in the COVID era when liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats are saying, let's empty the prisons as much as we can for health reasons. But it also shows that there is no belief that it is really going to do society any great harm or impose any great threat by having a more forgiving attitude toward these people, reducing their prison sentences. But another disconnect is between all of the celebration and veneration of John Lewis when he stood for exactly the opposite of a punitive attitude, even toward vicious, violent white supremacists that were trying to deny him and other African Americans the right to vote, and even denying them the right to peacefully protest. It's famously known that he forgave George Wallace. He also forgave one of the people, I think he was an Alabama local law enforcement officer who had personally physically beaten John Lewis and years later asked for forgiveness, and the two of them forged a positive relationship. So yes, there's too much hatred, but there's too much hatred of the haters, right? And I think my ultimate goal, and I did joke to my publisher, my next book is going to be called Love, How We Should Achieve It, because my ultimate goal is to promote at least equal, respect for equal dignity and human rights and inclusion in our democratic society of all voices, all views, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, you are entitled to the same fundamental human rights. And surely we're going to have very strong disagreements. Let those blossom. That's good for democracy. Let's not try to stifle them, and let's not try to disengage anybody from the debate. In the past, Steve, it's true that policies of racial exclusion and gender exclusion did and to some extent continue to disproportionately silence or marginalize the voices of people based on who they are, their demographic identities, if you will. And we have to do everything we can to overcome that. I personally think, and many people, experts concur, that the internet is a wonderful tool for doing that, right? In the very first Supreme Court case about the extent to which the internet would or would not receive First Amendment protection, by the way, I'm so proud that it went down in history under the name of Reno, who was the Attorney General for Bill Clinton, then in power, versus ACLU. And the ACLU won essentially unanimously, with the court celebrating the unprecedented power of this medium to essentially allow every single person on earth to communicate to every single other person on earth relatively cheaply, amazingly quickly. And of course, not everybody can afford access, relatively inexpensive as it is. So we have to do everything as a society that we can to make sure that the technology is equally available, that the skills in using it, the educational resources are distributed. And that is more important now than ever, with online being not only a luxury and an opportunity, but indeed a necessity even for the most basic education.
Philosophically speaking, the civil rights movement, at least to me, as I understand it, I didn't live through, the Martin Luther King years, obviously, but to me, it envisioned a post-racial future. It envisioned it, the famous speech, obviously, not to be judged by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And I feel like there is a regressive regressiveness happening, where now the color of your skin, your intersectional identity is being put front and center to the point where we can't see the individual anymore. To the point where now I, who claim to have no biases, have now put you in a box and are judging what I think your political views should be and your level of suffering should be before I even consider you as an individual.
And the legitimacy of your opining on certain issues, right? You're not even allowed to voice an opinion about certain subjects. I say allowed, quote unquote. Your voice is not going to be paid attention to. It's not going to be authentic unless you've lived a certain experience. And the ultimate extreme of that is so-called cultural appropriation. You can't even write about something if it is not out of your culture, whatever that means, in a proudly, to me, richly multicultural society. I'm looking here at my list of Audible books that I have just listened to, because there is one that I so highly recommend by Irshad Manji. Her first name is Irshad. Her last name is Manji. Came out in 2019. And the title of the book is Don't Label Me. Now, she would be the first person to say you should not consider who she is by virtue of these facts, but she happens to be, among infinite other factors, a lesbian, feminist, immigrant, South Asian, Muslim, young person. And I mention all of those not to take away from her complicated, interesting, fascinating individual personality, but to say having that cluster of labels that other people would put on her gives her a particularly advantageous platform to preach that to those who are inclined to label why they should not do so. And she uses the term plural, that we're all plural. And she makes exactly the point that you make, which I concur in wholeheartedly, that in too many ways we're just replicating the type of racism that Dr. King and John Lewis fought against. Now, let me add something very, very important here, Steve. And that is, although each one of us is a unique individual, like snowflakes, right? No two alike. However, it is true that other people, and perhaps even more significantly, societal institutions, do put labels on us and will interact with us as being white or African American or young or old or Muslim or Jewish and so forth. And so we would deny reality if we did not acknowledge that fact that a police officer individually or the criminal justice system on the whole may well respond differently to a dark-skinned young man than to a white-skinned old lady like me. But I think we are making progress.
It's interesting because I think that, a lot of your perception of the world is colored by the notions, the narratives that you believe. So, for example, if I moved into a house and I had a neighbor who was just a pain in the ass, kept calling the cops at 9 p.m. on a Saturday because you had friends over, or had, complained about, you mowing your lawn at a certain, hour in the morning, was a problematic person. If I saw that, I'm like, oh, this is clearly a horrible person who's probably angry at themselves in some capacity and taking it out on others. But given what's happening now, if I were black and the narratives that are swirling now, I would have no choice but to view this person as a racist. Meanwhile, I bet you they're equally horrible to everyone in their lives. And so I think that by implanting these narratives, we're perpetuating things that could also cripple people as well in their lives. And I think it causes you to see things, because if you walk out of the house and you're a young black male and you think that cops are out to murder you, that's not a healthy way to view the world. And also, it's not even realistic because, yes, there are bad cops and there is, police brutality. However, to think that someone wants to ruin the rest of their life by shooting someone unjustly and deal with all that is also not realistic.
I regularly make the point that it is as unjust and irrational to make overgeneralizations and stereotypes about white police officers as it is about black young men, right? But I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you.
No, I just think that it's the narratives, certain narratives can be poisonous or paralyzing. And I think that there's a lot of, in victim culture, there's a lot of disablement of people.
Yes.
Because look, we all have obstacles, and that's the thing. We've sort of sanctioned certain obstacles like race or sex-based ones, but we don't see the abusive parent. We don't see the drug addictions. We don't see childhood diseases. We don't see immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I'm speaking to you my second language. I came here as a kid from the Soviet Union. So I grew up in a poor neighborhood and I was stomping cockroaches with 99-cent slippers. But do I have to announce that in every conversation just to get credibility to make a point? And I feel like you almost have to now. But that's the thing. If you always lead with your victimhood and don't consider the full ledger of pros and cons that every single person has, the biggest of which is being born in a country that, is, quite frankly, is a lot better than a lot of other places in the world, most, I would say. And so I think there's a danger in taking people down the victimhood route and whether they see themselves as victims or projecting victimhood onto others. And a lot of it, I think, is rooted in ignorance, because if I didn't grow up with black people, which I did because of what I just explained, you just see black people as people. You see Hispanic people as people. You see, I lived around Pakistanis, just people. Now, what's strange though is if you live in a rich suburb and you think about black people, you might lionize them in a strange way, just like someone who lives in a poor suburb somewhere in the middle of the country could start hating them, and both come out of ignorance and both bad in their own ways.
Which is why I read yet another paper on one of my favorite strategies for overcoming hatred and stereotyping of every sort, and it goes back to a landmark book that was written by a Harvard sociology professor in the early 1950s named Gordon Allport, and the book was called The Nature of Prejudice. He deliberately wrote it right after the Holocaust because people were understandably consumed with how do we stop something like this from happening again, the hatred that powered actual genocide. And then in the United States at that point we still had racial apartheid by law. How do we counter the attitudes that allow the government to enact such discriminatory, murderous policies? And he formulated something called the contact theory, which continues to be replicated, validated thousands and thousands of times all over the world in so many different settings. I just read a new study about it this morning by 5 different authors, and it's very common sense, but it's wonderful when social science validates it that the best way to overcome prejudice and stereotypes about a certain group is to actually have contact with individual members of that group. And just as you said, Steve,
who knew?
What's so interesting about his research is it showed that it's far more predictive of whether somebody will be non-discriminatory toward a certain group. And it's been done with all kinds of groups, based on age, based on race, gender, religion, political parties, you name it. It's far more predictive of whether somebody will be open-minded is not their political party, it's not their education, it's not their ideological orientation. It is, have they had contact with
Yeah.
people in those groups? Now, what's really, really interesting, the later iterations, and this includes the paper I read this morning, have shown that what is called parasocial contact or vicarious contact or extended contact is almost as powerfully positive as direct interpersonal contact. So if you see a media depiction of somebody, or if you have a friend who has a friendship with somebody in the other group, that is almost as powerful. And here so this shows why movements such as Oscars So White and Emmys So White and movements to increase the voices of color among children's book authors in particular, and the depiction of various minority groups. This is really important. This is not just symbolism, which is powerful in and of itself, but it has a demonstrated ability to reduce stereotypes and promote actual positive intergroup action. And given how segregated many of our lives are, I mean, you alluded to the suburbs, they're mostly white, right?
Yeah.
We have such entrenched patterns of housing segregation that in turn lead to school segregation that many people don't have. Oh, and let's talk, now we know about political segregation, right? You can look at somebody's zip code and predict what political party they're going to be in. So we have diminishing opportunities to actually engage with people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who don't vote like us. So it's really important to have parasocial contact through media and through the internet.
Well, so that's a point that I would actually challenge. I haven't read the study, so I would say that both are important, but the latter, the para contact, is dangerous too, because there's so many people in a position to shape narratives, and those narratives have tremendous power. So in the absence of having those interpersonal connections, those narratives will take over and they will drive the bus of your life and your perception of other people. And that's where I think the danger is. So a lot of what we're seeing is a byproduct of solely having these secondary exposures, which a lot of people have an agenda that they're trying to promote, sometimes nobly, but still misguided perhaps. And so I think it's very dangerous to only interact that way, or to have your only notions of what another group is like through the second-hand devices.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would advocate that as the only option, but sometimes, in fact, it may well be the only option. I tell you, I have so many friends in Manhattan who literally say they do not know a single person who voted for Donald Trump. Now,
let's take them hunting.
Maybe people are lying to them, but they'd either have to take a field trip somewhere else, or watch a Trump supporter on TV, or engage with one on the internet.
Yeah, well, those are the bubbles, right? So we form these bubbles, and it's almost like we need a domestic exchange program where people from Manhattan get to go into, Oklahoma or Kentucky and live there for a month or two.
Well, I may tell you, you don't have to go that far. I'm one of the fortunate middle-class Manhattanites who has a country house, which is in Litchfield County, Connecticut, not too far, an hour and 15 minutes drive from my apartment in Manhattan. And this county went for Donald Trump. The town that I live in voted for Donald Trump. And I do know not in Manhattan, but in Connecticut, many Trump supporters, and they are fine people. Now, I have to tell you, I abhor most of his policies, not all of them. You know, we were talking about criminal justice, and he
Mhm.
did support and sign the Smart Justice Act. So, you know, in fairness, my disposition and that of the organization I long headed is never to wholesale either condemn or praise any candidate or official or party wholesale. Rather, we take it on an issue by issue basis. And I've never encountered anybody or any group with whom I do not agree strongly on some important issues. That said, I disagree strongly with Trump on many issues, but that doesn't mean that people who voted for him are evil people. I understand why they did. It was out of economic despair, and most of them, I think, are not planning on voting for him again. But they really believed that he was their best hope for earning a living wage and having a meaningful life for themselves and their families.
And to some extent, even cultural despair. Because I feel like, in the context of the media largely being dominated by left wing voices, he was a guy who's kind of standing up to that. And so to them, it's like, okay, I may not love his, personality or even policies, but I like the fact that there's someone who at least is pushing back in a way that no one else was.
And I think, the major theme that we keep coming back to, Steve, is that how complicated and nuanced it is. You can't oversimplify, you can't overgeneralize. Yes, assuming that you, on balance, think that Donald Trump is a terrible candidate, and a terrible president, that does not mean that anybody who voted for him should just be reduced to that. And by the way, I have met people who have said they will, and people I respect and like, who say they will not do business with somebody who vote if they found out that person voted for Donald Trump. I have a friend who's a dentist, and patients have asked him, did you vote for Trump? And when he says that he did, even if they've had a relationship with him for years, they just walk out the door, never to go in again. And that gets back to, to me, this is a form of hatred. It's reducing somebody, going back to Ershad's book, to a single label, something that you dislike, and then overlooking every single other positive attribute about that person,
Right,
including,
right.
in this case, his great skill as a dentist and the wonderful service he's provided for so many years.
There have been many discussions and a couple of lawsuits regarding whether these platforms are now the public square. And if indeed it is the public square, banning someone from the public square is essentially like taking their right of free speech away. Yes, they can still scream on the street, but if they're connected to all their friends and family and whoever else online, now you've cut them off from a very important channel. If you were the attorney for, let's say, Prager University, which has been demonetized on YouTube, and some of their videos were banned. Alex Jones, let's say you were representing them as an attorney. What would be your best argument for giving them access to these platforms?
My
Or
best
should they?
Yeah, my best argument, Steve, would not be a legal one, because I don't think there is a legal claim, nor do I think there should be. I don't think the government should have the power to dictate to private sector companies, whether it be your podcast or whether it be Facebook or whether it be the New York Times or Fox News. They should be free, as a matter of their First Amendment rights, to decide what messages to air and what not to air. However, as a matter of policy and principle, both, I would urge those companies not to kick off controversial speakers in the hope that somehow that is going to mute their supposedly dangerous or feared ideas, because experience shows that it does not do that. That attempting to censor somebody simply has a boomerang effect. Some people call it the Streisand effect, because years ago, Barbara Streisand tried to keep pictures of her Malibu home off the internet, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people who had never been interested before
They
wanted
probably
to
put
see it.
Pokemon
And
in
yeah,
there.
yeah. When Alex Jones was kicked off YouTube, I remember seeing him toasting with the champagne, the way Milo Yiannopoulos loved being deplatformed on campus, because it gives them attention and sympathy that they otherwise would not have received. And they can just go to another platform anywhere where it becomes harder to monitor them and to respond to them and to refute them and to recruit them away. So I truly, the full title of my book, the main title is Hate, but the rest of it is important too, in those white letters, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. And this is not only as a matter of principle, because I deeply am committed to individual freedom of choice with respect to what we choose to say and not to say, and to listen to and not to listen to. But I really believe, as somebody who is passionately committed to advancing equal respect and inclusivity for everybody, that it is best and most effectively done through the proverbial more speech rather than less, counter speech rather than censorship. And that leads to, threading together this whole, to me, really interesting conversation. To me, one of the most challenging issues running through all of this, which is, when does the free speech right to engage in really harsh criticism of people as well as ideas, and the free speech right to advocate you should be fired, when does that cross the line from counter speech that we want to encourage to bullying, canceling, harassing, doxing,
Right.
trolling, etc., that we want to discourage? And I think in some cases that is a very difficult line to draw. And the reason, earlier I mentioned John Stuart Mill, his classic work on liberty, which is the just most brilliant defense of freedom of speech. He focuses entirely not on government censorship, not on direct government coercion, but rather on peer pressure and social pressure, which he says, as a practical matter, have at least as much of a speech suppressive effect. And that's exactly what you and I are
Right.
talking about. Cancel culture is a group of people exercising their free speech rights. But when does that, I would never support government censorship of it, but I want to create a different culture that is not in favor of canceling, but, is in favor of counter speech, but not to the point of cancellation.
So I have two questions then. One is platform related, the other one is people related. So on the platform side, is there in your mind a point at which something that is a private entity becomes a public utility? Is there a level of dominance, and what would be that point in your mind when it comes to social media platforms?
So first, before I tell you my view, let me tell you what the U.S. Supreme Court has held, because I don't see any chance that this court is going to change that. The doctrine, the basic doctrine that most people aren't aware of, that you're alluding to, is the so-called state action doctrine, with the word state being used the way it is in international law, not to refer to New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and so forth, but to refer to government, the head of state. So our Constitution, including the First Amendment, only binds state actors, government officials. So that's why private sector actors are not responsible to respect anybody else's First Amendment rights, and indeed have their own First Amendment rights, as we already talked about. That said, the Supreme Court has carved out two major exceptions to the state action doctrine. And one is the one to which you're alluding, I think, Steve, is the so-called public function doctrine. But that is extremely narrowly defined. When the private sector actor carries out a function that has traditionally exclusively been carried out by the government, then the government can't in effect do an end run around the Constitution by delegating what should be its functions to a private sector actor. So good examples here are private prisons, private militias, right? These are carrying out functions that have traditionally been carried out exclusively by the government. But when you try to get beyond that and say, well, what about, and there have been many cases involving government utilities that are utility companies that are government established monopolies, extremely heavily regulated by the government, have their prices set by the government and so forth. Even that, the court has said, is not enough to come within this public function exception. And that, as you know, that's been the argument that's been made by Prager University and many others all over the country. People who have had their, been kicked off or have certain messages kicked off various social media platforms have tried to shoehorn their way into the public function exception. And to the best of my knowledge, not a single judge anywhere in the country has accepted that argument. And so that's what the Supreme Court holding is. And I think it is the correct holding. And here I'm going to associate myself with my friends and colleagues in the Electronic Frontier Foundation. That is my go-to source for issues about digital free speech and other digital human rights. And in the Prager University case and in all of these other cases, EFS has filed briefs that I find very persuasive, in which it says, we have a lot of problems and disagreements with how the social media companies are exercising their huge content moderation policy, and it has enormous adverse impact, as you well said, Steve. If for all practical purposes, if you are kicked off that platform, you can't reasonably reach the audience that you need to reach to be a participant in our democratic republic, as well as a deep violation of your own individual liberty. So I see that power as being very threatening to democracy itself, as well as to individual liberty. But one has to always ask, as compared to what? What's the alternative? What's the lesser of two evils? And to me, it's even more dangerous to have government come in and directly regulate how these private sector companies are interacting with their customers. I think that's extremely dangerous and would ramp up government power to, in effect, suppress all the individuals who now can go onto these platforms.
One argument that I haven't heard in any channel or suit that's been brought so far is the confiscation of an asset that you've built up. So if you are on one of these platforms and you've spent time and money to build an audience, you built connections, you advertised the URL for your Facebook and Instagram pages and so on, and now you've accumulated this money-making asset. Isn't the confiscation of that asset potentially anti-competitive? And wouldn't that be subject to some sort of regulatory, whether it's FTC or some other type of regulation? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very creative and interesting and beyond my sphere of expertise.
Okay.
But let me throw out two facts to consider. Number one is summed up by Section 230. This is the very important federal statute that was passed soon after the internet came to Congress's attention, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And it basically gives very broad immunity to online platforms for any decision they make, either about what speech to retain or what speech to not permit on their platform. And although I haven't followed it as there are people who specialize full time, and
Right.
because there's so many decisions all over the country. I've read books and I've read many of the cases, but I haven't read all of them. But my general impression is that courts have interpreted that extremely broadly and have rejected basically any lawsuit on whatever theory has been advanced, and maybe that particular one has not. I can't swear to it.
Hmm.
But Section 230 may be a bar to it. And as you probably know, Congress is reconsidering, or there was a lot of effort supported by the Trump administration to re-examine the broad immunity, which would make me nervous as well,
Hmm.
because if the companies were not immunized, then they would be taking a much harder look at what they allow on and what they kick off, and serving more of a traditional gatekeeper function. And I don't want to go back to those days. I'm older than you, and I remember what it was like when we had only the big three broadcasters, not
Right.
even four. And, the idea of being, turning the clock back in the direction of that straitjacket, and, for all of its imperfections and flaws, we still have, much closer to infinite voices and infinite perspectives on the internet than we've had in any other medium, and that we would have if that immunization was taken away. The other point I wanted to follow up on, Steve, is you mentioned the notion of FTC and competition, and absolutely, I know hearings are about to occur. Congress and many others are, both Democrats and Republicans, are very interested in taking a hard look at our antitrust laws, our pro-competition laws, to see whether any of these companies might be found in violation, as they have been in Europe,
Right.
violating EU antitrust laws. And to me, it's not a given conclusion, right? I happen to be married to an economist, and he knows quite a bit about antitrust. And he said, it really depends. You have to do a very careful analysis of defining the markets and what's the market share. And it's just because they're big doesn't mean that they are acting in an anti-competitive way. In fact, as you probably know, there's a lot of disagreement about as to how exactly do we define something that's anti-competition? Do we look at it from a consumer welfare point of view, or do we look at it from the point of view of potential competitors?
Yeah.
From a free speech perspective, Steve, since you've told me what your solution would be, my ideal solution, and it is something that's voiced by my friends at Electronic Frontier Foundation and ACLU and other digital rights groups, and that would be to maximize individual freedom of choice, rather than having top-down authoritative control by a single powerful entity, whether it be the government or whether it be a company. All of us end users would be able to select what information we get and what information is blocked based on our own values and tastes and preferences, and that we would be able to have different filtering options and use the services of different intermediaries building onto the basic platform architecture. The technical term here is interoperability. They would have to make that architecture available to others, and that would be ideal from, I think, not only an individual liberty and democracy point of view, but I should think that would be very good from a business point of view, because there's no way a single solution is going to satisfy all the customers. The Republicans are going to continue to say that too many conservative voices are being suppressed, and the Democrats say the opposite, by the way,
Yeah.
right? Or Black Lives Matter activists say you're taking down our messages too much, and other people are saying, but wait, Black Lives Matter is advocating violence against the police. By the way, I disagree with that, but people are never going to agree on what is positive and beneficial, or what is hateful and dangerous.
One thing that is an example of your solution, and really what EFF would essentially recommend, which is, okay, build something else that will compete with these platforms, and you still do have speech, but you can, you're not obligated to have it on YouTube or
Yes.
Facebook. But there was an example recently of a platform built called Gab. Now, Gab created this alternative platform. Of course, it attracted a lot of troll types and people who maybe have been kicked off elsewhere. They're not doing anything illegal necessarily, or at all, I think. No one proved that, let's put it that way. But when Gab tried to monetize their platform, they were blocked by PayPal. They were blocked by MasterCard. They couldn't have access to financial services. And the platform, the hosting company, if I'm not mistaken, also kicked them off. So now, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't tell people, hey, go start your own platform. Someone does, and then you disable them by taking away infrastructure layers. So the infrastructure layer should not have a politicization to it. Oh my God, that's a big word.
Yes, yes. And you referred to EFF, and many years ago they put out a position paper, which I think makes eminent great sense, which is that the deeper you get down into the infrastructure, the less power you should have to deny services, just the way we don't deny access to mail delivery or to receiving water or, internet connections.
Even Ted Kaczynski got mail service.
Exactly. And so, if the higher up you get to the message itself, including the social media platform, then it's your right. And that's why is a company such as Cloudflare, which apparently is one of very few that provides the protection against denial of services, right? Their CEO for a long time had a policy of, we're just going to be, we're like the water pipes that bring water to your home. We can't discriminate based on who you are or what your ideas are. But after Charlottesville in 2017, for the very first time, they cut off service to the Daily Stormfront and the
Stormer, I think. Yeah.
Stormer, right. One is online and one,
I feel bad for knowing that, but yes.
I always forget because the names are so similar. And the CEO, you may remember his name. I'm blanking out on it right now.
Prince is his last name.
Right. Was it Matthew Prince?
It's either Matthew or I feel like Eric Prince. Yeah. Anyway,
he was agonized when he did that, and he issued this statement, and he said, this morning I got out of bed and I felt very angry about the Daily Stormer, and so I cut off their services. He said nobody should have the power to do that. And a few years later, I guess last summer, they repeated it with respect to a site that had been used for some violence by a white supremacist. It's sad that there have been so many incidents.
Was that 4chan or 8chan or one of the
exactly.
chans, right?
Yeah, it was one of the chans, and it had been used for some mass murderers. And again, he issued a very conflicted statement. He said, we did this for the Stormer, and they immediately found another outlet. And I have no doubt that the same thing's going to happen here. So this is good for us. It makes us feel good, but it's not really accomplishing anything. And so that's what my overall theme is. And the argument that I would make to Facebook is not that you have a legal obligation, or it wasn't Facebook who kicked off Prager University.
That was YouTube demonetized their videos.
Okay. So I wouldn't say to YouTube, you are a public utility and you should be subject to the First Amendment, but I'd say, look, since you really care about not amplifying this message and counteracting it, the least effective thing that you can do is to kick them off, because then they're going to gain sympathy and people are going to lose the opportunity to try to dissuade them. So if you want to do something that's beyond symbolic and likely to have a real impact, keep them up and encourage people to engage with them.
Well, but what is your, because I agree with everything you're saying in terms of individual leverage and also the ineffectiveness of bans, because those things will go underground, they'll fester, and they'll probably become worse because now you've created a hero and a cause. And so then the question is, what mechanism can be used to pressure companies, because they already have the ultimate pressure as far as they see it, which is profitability, right? So if they
Yes.
think they're going to net out more profitable by getting rid of these people, they will. They're not acting in the best interest of
Yeah.
society. So
Yeah.
then how does society push back effectively?
And, you're asking such a bedeviling question that has frustrated me and other free speech activists, including in the ACLU, as far back as I can remember, which is that the pro-censorship forces always seem to be much more cohesive and well organized and fervent over the particular speech that they hate, whereas those of us who defend free speech in general, that's a rather diffuse cause, and it's
An
hard.
unpopular one.
It's hard to rally us.
Yeah.
I remember, way back in the 90s where there were real crackdowns on cable TV and over-the-air TV, for that matter, by liberals and conservatives, against violence and against sexual
Tipper
expression.
Gore.
You had so many people who were focused on those particular issues, and then you had those of us who cared about free speech, but we weren't really doing much in terms of a consumer movement, right? You have the advocacy organizations, but in terms of constituent pressure, we just weren't nearly as well organized and mobilized. And there too, if you can come up with a silver bullet solution, I and many others are all ears. There's been a lot of advocacy by experts, but I don't think there's been, which I find very persuasive, and hopefully the companies might as well. But in terms of those clients, customers weighing in, I don't think the voice is there.
You know, the thing that is implicit in what you just said is I feel like there's an abandonment of principle that's happening right now. And a very hard principle to stick to is free speech, because that involves you protecting something that you might personally abhor, whether it's Alex Jones or whether it's ACLU, which is, one of the reasons I respect the organization so much. The example I keep going back to of principle is Skokie, which is, ACLU is filled with Jews as far as I can tell. I'm a Jew. But I also believe in the principles of the country, which to me means free speech above all, even if it's speech that you disagree with. We already have laws for inciting violence and things like that. So if people that you abhor want to march, as much as I hate those people or I hate their message, I have to fight for their right to do it. And I think it was a little bit before your time at the organization, maybe.
I had just graduated from law school, so I was very involved in the debates. I didn't have a leadership position in the ACLU, but it was certainly something that I completely agreed with, and a proud card-carrying member of the ACLU. But one important point that you alluded to, Steve, that I will dispute, and that is free speech above all. I don't think it's above all. I am absolutely convinced in that situation and every other that I've witnessed, that freedom of speech is essential for promoting all other human rights.
Right.
And precisely because I believe as fervently in racial equality and religious equality, and my father is a Holocaust survivor. And more importantly, since you're referring to the ACLU, the national executive director of the ACLU at the time of the Skokie case, Aryeh Nair, a towering human rights giant. He went on to become the founding executive director of Human Rights Watch and of the Open Society Foundation for Soros. Aryeh was himself a Holocaust survivor. Born in Berlin, most of his family was completely assassinated by the Nazis. He and his immediate family escaped after suffering enormous hardship and privation. And Ari actually said, he wrote this wonderful book after the Skokie case, which is a classic. I reread it every few years, called Defending My Enemy. The subtitle has something to do with the risks of freedom. Short, but an excellent read. And in that book, he says, I love free speech, but much as I love free speech, I loathe the Nazis even more than I love free speech. So if I were convinced that censoring the Nazis would have stopped them from rising to power, would have stopped the genocide and Holocaust, I would have been all in favor of it. And then he goes into the history of Germany and the Weimar Republic, during which the Nazis rose to power. They did censor Nazis, right? And Julius Streicher, the publisher of Der Stürmer, right? That's where
the other
U.S.
Stormer
took its name, right? Was dozens of times repeatedly prosecuted and convicted, and the Nazis loved it. These trials became propaganda platforms for them. They gained sympathy that they otherwise never would have. So the ACLU, which defends all fundamental freedoms for everybody, does not elevate freedom of speech above other rights, but agrees with the Supreme Court that it is essential for advocating any other human right. And, again, in the spirit of justly legendary John Lewis, who is being laid to rest as we record this, he and other leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States, including Martin Luther King, always opposed censorship, including of hate speech. And the same has been true for other social justice movements, starting with the abolitionists and women's suffragists and on throughout our history. They have opposed censorship because the censorship has been used against them. Strange as it may seem to us, abolitionist speech and pro-civil rights speech is denounced as hateful and dangerous and subversive and offensive and defamatory. Every expletive that we use now, fortunately, against pro-racist speech.
Yeah, and I think that's a better way of putting my original point, which is the reason I say above all, and maybe there's a better way to phrase it, is that that's the mechanism by which you affect dissent in a country.
Yes.
And so if you eliminate that lever, then what's left for you to, right the wrongs in a nation or to fight for civil rights if you can't speak up and reach other people?
Exactly.
Do you feel like there's been a change in the organization? Because I get the sense that today's ACLU may not take the same stance on Skokie as the original ACLU or the one that you led for quite a long time. What was it, over 25 years or something like that?
Not quite that long.
91
years. As long ago that I had to think. 18 years.
18 years.
And the organization is 100 years old this year. And as you allude to, Steve, going back to the very beginning of the organization in the 1920s, we were already defending freedom of speech for fascists and other extremists, even though they were advocating against our very own civil liberties positions. And we always said we therefore have a special responsibility to exercise our free speech rights, to be out there counter demonstrating. But the ACLU is continuing in that tradition, most recently and extremely controversially, as Skokie was controversial. I mean, to you and me, it was the right thing, and it was a slam dunk in the courts of law, by the way, because the Supreme Court, starting in the mid 20th century, has been very speech protective and has consistently defended as what it calls the bedrock principle of freedom of speech, this idea of viewpoint neutrality. Government must remain neutral to the viewpoint, the message, the content, the idea of the speech. And just the fact that it is loathed or despised or generally feared is never a justification for censoring it. It is a justification for refuting it and
Yeah.
responding to it. So it was a slam dunk winner in the courts of law, but it was extremely unpopular in the court of public opinion. And the ACLU lost 15% of our members
I didn't
as
know
a
that.
result of the Skokie case. Even people who generally are free speech absolutists, this went too far even for them. So when people say to me today, oh, is there less support for free speech and less support for freedom for hate speech? I say, this time around, so bringing it up to the present, in 2017, the ACLU defended Unite the Right's right to demonstrate in Charlottesville. The city council, right in the week before, so the Unite the Right had gotten a permit to demonstrate in this park that had a statue of Robert E. Lee. They had done that months in advance of the August demonstration, and just a few days before that long planned demonstration, the city tried to move them out of the park. And they asked the ACLU to defend their right to demonstrate in that park. The ACLU did so. And we have received enormous criticism and protests, including from some staff members within the organization. But to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of mass membership resignations at all. The way we saw in the Skokie case. So I think I know there continues to be the same strong support for the underlying principles. Now, in the wake of the criticism, the ACLU did something which I think is extremely well advised, and I support and emulate, and that is to say, look, we need to do a better job of explaining what we're doing here, because people will, they constantly say to me, why did the ACLU defend Nazis? Why did the ACLU defend white supremacists? We don't defend Nazis or white supremacists. We defend freedom of speech, which in this particular case happens to redound to the benefit of those speakers, but in the next case is going to redound to the benefit of the counter demonstrators who are espousing exactly the opposite message. But that didn't come through loud and clear, and so the ACLU adopted some very thoughtful procedures that it should follow in handling one of these cases in the future, including working very hard with allies in the community and people who disagree with our view and the court's view on the First Amendment, working with the media to explain that we are not abandoning our commitment to racial justice by getting involved in these cases. To the contrary.
It's interesting, just to maybe turn things a little bit. You're still so passionate. You quit your old job. You're writing books. You're doing podcasts. What still drives you? What motivates you? What is it? The same things that motivated you when you got into this as they are now, or have things changed as you matured and your philosophies matured as well?
Wow, I am so impassioned about these fundamental freedoms because they are so central to my vision of what it is to lead a full and fulfilling life as a human being. How can we realize our individual potential unless we have freedom of thought and freedom of speech? How can we as a society fulfill our potential as this wonderful experimental democratic republic, imperfect and flawed, but how can we live up to the wonderful ideals penned by that flawed human being, Thomas Jefferson, that all of us are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We can't do that unless we are able to not only raise our voices individually, but also to assemble together and to petition our government for redress of grievances. And the more experience I have, Steve, the more I try my best. I'm a flawed human being along with all the rest of us, but I try my best to be completely open-minded and to learn from experience, to learn from discussions as I've learned from you, which is one of the reasons I never get tired of speaking to anybody, whether it be a grade school class or a podcast or anybody else, that I am open-minded, but the lessons I learn and through my own experience and vicariously through learning of other experiences of other human rights activists around the world, I am more convinced than ever that free-flowing speech, including even, especially for ideas that are considered hateful and that are hated, are the absolute prerequisite for any positive social change, for any advancement toward any cause. And so that's why white supremacists embrace it for their cause. And that's why anti-white supremacists defend the principle, because we need it essentially for our cause.
I usually like to end these things with the question or ask you of a prescription or a prediction about the future. That sounded an awful lot like a prescription. But is there something else that maybe we haven't discussed that you think is an important thing that either you see coming that we should be aware of, or something that we should either at a personal level or maybe more as a country be trying to achieve or accomplish?
As an educator and as an advocate, wearing both of my professional hats, I believe so profoundly, and again, this is something that has been true throughout my life, and it just keeps getting reinforced, that education, and more education is absolutely critical. We are dealing with a lot of potentially dangerous speech, as we always have throughout society, and any attempt to, quote, protect people against the potential dangers through censorship is doomed to fail. Lately, there have been so many calls, including among many liberals, to restrict disinformation about the pandemic, about the election, other important events. Somebody told me, I haven't had a chance to check it out, that a group of doctors apparently was kicked off one of the major social media platforms, either today or very recently, because they were voicing views about the pandemic that were not seen as true by the platform enforcers. And I consider that to be really, really dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there can be quack ideas and doctors who have theories that are not verifiable, but I don't want some social media company making those decisions. On the other hand, I don't want people who listen to those doctors or to anybody else to just credulously believe it because they said it. It is more important now than ever that all of us be trained deeply in critical thinking, critical analysis. What sounds rather quaint, the term has been media literacy. And just as the internet can be a purveyor of many falsehoods and hatreds and myths, it is also an unprecedentedly powerful tool for investigating, analyzing, exploring, fact-checking, researching, getting to the truth ourselves. But it takes media literacy and skills to be able to do that, and that is the most crucial tool that we can give to our children and to future citizens and political leaders to use our free speech tools, if you will, as the best ammunition against potential dangers that speech can do.
I find it ironic that critical theory is accepted so uncritically by people.
It is ironic, isn't it?
Why so many uncritical minds are adopting something called critical theory.
And that it's become an orthodoxy that's antithetical to the whole idea.
This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really, really enjoyed it.
All right, that's it for this episode. Don't forget to go to the Patreon, where I have an amazing bonus with Nadine, where I share with her my big idea for canceling cancel culture, and you get to hear whether she agrees with it or not. Also, if you enjoyed this, share with others, review, and whatever else you do on these platforms. And I will see you next week with a spectacular and controversial series I've been preparing and kind of dreading putting out because it is so controversial. Anyway, I think you'll enjoy it, so see you next week.